The morning of my husband's funeral arrived wrapped in rain. The kind that doesn't storm or shout, just seeps into everything quietly, like grief itself. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at a woman I barely recognized. My eyes were swollen, my skin pale, my hands trembling as I fastened the black coat I had worn only once before. I kept telling myself to breathe, to move, to do what was expected of a widow. Everyone said the same thing. Be strong, lean on family, this will pass. But nothing about that morning felt temporary. It felt final, like the closing of a door I hadn't chosen to shut. The church was already full when we arrived. The air smelled of lilies and damp wool coats, a heavy mix that pressed down on my chest. People whispered condolences, their voices soft and rehearsed, hands reaching out to touch my arm as if that alone could steady me. I nodded, smiled faintly, thanked them, all while feeling strangely detached, like I was watching myself from far away. At the front of the church stood my husband's coffin, polished and still, surrounded by white roses. White. I remember thinking how wrong that was. He hated white flowers, said they looked cold and lifeless. I wondered who had chosen them, and why no one had asked me. As the service began, the pastor's voice blended into the background. Words about love, legacy, and loss floated past me without landing. My focus kept drifting to small, unimportant details. The pattern in the stained glass windows, the sound of rain tapping against the roof, the way my daughter squeezed my hand every few minutes as if to remind herself I was still there. I wanted to tell her I was fine, but the truth was, I felt hollow, empty in a way that scared me more than pain would have. And then, without warning, I felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. I lifted my eyes slowly, scanning the rows of black coats and bowed heads. Near the back of the church, partially hidden behind two men I recognized from my husband's workplace, stood a man who should not have been there. My breath caught in my throat. My heart skipped, then pounded so violently I thought I might collapse. It was him. My husband. Thinner, paler, but undeniably alive. For a split second, my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Grief does strange things, I told myself. Hallucinations. Wishful thinking. But then he looked directly at me. Our eyes locked. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one finger to his lips. A silent command. Don't speak. The world tilted. I gripped the pew in front of me, my legs weak, my vision blurring. My husband was alive, standing at his own funeral. Before I could react, before I could even inhale properly, a hand touched my shoulder. I flinched hard enough to draw attention. You should sit, my sister-in-law whispered, her voice gentle but firm. You look unwell. I nodded automatically and sat, my eyes darting back to where he had been standing. The spot was empty, gone, as if he had never been there at all. My heart raced as I scanned the crowd again, but every face looked ordinary, mournful, unaware. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my mind had finally broken under the weight of everything. The rest of the service passed in a blur. I stood when I was told to stand, sat when I was told to sit, accepted hugs, murmured thanks. Outside, the rain continued, thin and relentless. People gathered in small groups, sharing memories, speaking softly about my husband as if he were already nothing more than a story. I felt sick listening to them describe a man who just minutes ago had been watching me from the shadows. As I reached for my car keys, my phone vibrated in my hand. Unknown number. Run. They're watching us. My blood turned cold. I read the message again and again, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Us. Not me. Us. I looked around the parking lot, suddenly aware of every car, every movement. Across the street, a dark SUV sat with its engine running, tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. At the church entrance, my sister-in-law and my son-in-law stood talking, both glancing in my direction just a little too often. Another message appeared. Don't go home. That was the moment everything changed. The moment grief gave way to fear, and fear hardened into something sharper. My husband was alive. Someone was watching me, and the life I thought I knew had been a carefully staged illusion. I unlocked my car, locked it again immediately, and drove away without looking back, unaware that this was only the beginning of a truth far more dangerous than death itself. I didn't drive with any clear destination in mind. My hands were locked around the steering wheel. Knuckles white, my heart still racing as if it were trying to escape my chest. Every red light felt like a trap, every car behind me a threat. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see my husband's face again, or that dark SUV pulling closer. My phone buzzed once more, and I nearly swerved off the road. Another message from the same unknown number. You weren't supposed to see me today. The word sat on the screen like a confession, and a warning at the same time. I pulled into the parking lot of a small grocery store and just sat there, engine running, breathing in shallow bursts, trying to make sense of a reality that no longer followed any rules I understood. For over 25 years, I had shared my life with that man. Our routines, our arguments, our quiet evenings watching television. None of it hinted at secrets this large. He wasn't reckless or dramatic. He was careful, predictable, the kind of man who triple-checked locks and read the fine print. Which meant whatever was happening now wasn't an accident. It was planned. And that realization frightened me more than seeing him alive ever could. I scrolled back through our last messages from weeks before the accident that supposedly took his life. Nothing unusual. No goodbyes. No hidden clues. Just mundane exchanges about groceries, bills, and a reminder for me to water the plants while he was away on a business trip. A business trip he never returned from, at least that's what they told me. The police said it was a single-vehicle accident. No witnesses. The body badly burned. Closed casket. I remembered how quickly everything moved after that. The paperwork. The condolences. The insistence that I shouldn't see him one last time. I had trusted them. Trusted everyone. Another memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. The insurance agent's urgency. The notary who arrived only 2 days after the funeral. Smiling politely as she slid documents across my dining table. I had been numb, barely reading the pages before signing where she pointed. At the time, I thought it was kindness. Helping a grieving widow manage affairs she couldn't face. Now, sitting alone in my car, I wondered how many of those signatures I would regret for the rest of my life. My phone buzzed again. You need to disappear for a few days. Don't tell anyone. Especially family. Family. The word twisted in my stomach. If my husband was alive, and someone had gone to such lengths to fake his death, who else knew? Who had helped him? My sister-in-law's calm efficiency after the funeral. My son-in-law's sudden interest in my finances. Even my own children, who had gently but persistently suggested I move closer to them, sell the house, simplify my life. Had they known? Or had they simply trusted the wrong people? The same way I had? I turned off the engine and finally allowed myself to cry. Not the polite tears I'd shed in front of others, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place of betrayal so profound it felt physical. I had buried a man who was still breathing. I had mourned him, defended his memory, clung to the idea of our shared life. All while he watched from the shadows. The anger crept in slowly, threading itself through the fear. Not explosive rage, but something colder, clearer. I was done being confused, done being led. I restarted the car and drove somewhere no one would think to look. A small coastal town 2 hours away, where my aunt once lived before she passed. I remembered the narrow streets, the quiet harbor, the anonymous comfort of a place that held no expectations of me. I checked into a modest motel under my maiden name, paid cash, and left my phone turned off for the first time in years. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my marriage through a new lens, searching for signs I had missed. In the early hours of the morning, there was a knock at my door. Soft, careful. My breath caught. I didn't move. The knock came again, followed by a familiar voice, low and urgent. It's me. We don't have much time. My husband was standing on the other side of that door. Alive. Afraid. And finally ready to explain. I stood frozen on the other side of the door, my hand hovering inches from the handle, my mind screaming at me to run while my heart demanded answers. When I finally opened it, there he was, older than I remembered, his hair thinner, his face marked by exhaustion rather than death. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stared at each other, the silence heavier than any argument we had ever had. Then he stepped inside quickly, locking the door behind him as if the world itself were a threat. He looked around the small motel room, wary, before meeting my eyes again. "I never wanted you dragged into this," he said, his voice rough. "But you weren't supposed to see me at the funeral." I laughed then. Not because anything was funny, but because my mind couldn't process the absurdity of it all. "You stood at your own funeral," I said, my voice shaking. "You watched me bury you." He flinched at that, finally looking ashamed. He told me the truth in pieces, as if saying it all at once would collapse whatever fragile balance he was clinging to. The accident had been staged. Not for money, not for another woman, but to disappear from people who had been closing in on him for months. Business partners who weren't partners at all. Deals that had gone bad. Threats that turned from whispered warnings into promises of violence. He said he thought vanishing was the only way to keep us safe. "What about me?" I asked quietly. "Did it ever cross your mind what this would do to me?" He looked away. That answer hurt more than anything he could have said aloud. He admitted he had trusted others to handle things after his death. Legal matters, finances, protection. People he believed would look out for me. People who, it was becoming clear, had seen an opportunity instead. The insurance delays, the rushed paperwork, the pressure from family members to simplify my life, all of it suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. He warned me that the people watching me weren't interested in my grief. They were interested in control, in assets, in silence. "They think you're weak," he said. "They think you'll do what you're told." I felt something harden inside me then. For years, I had accepted being underestimated as the price of keeping peace. Now I saw it as a dangerous mistake, on their part. I told him I wouldn't run. I wouldn't vanish. And I certainly wouldn't sign another piece of paper without understanding exactly who benefited from it. We talked until dawn, unraveling lies layered so thick they felt like another life entirely. He admitted he couldn't come back. Not yet, maybe not ever. Not without risking everything again. He asked me to be careful, to trust no one blindly, not even family. Before he left, he pressed a small envelope into my hand. Inside were copies of documents, account numbers, names, threads that, if pulled carefully, could expose everything that had been hidden from me. When he walked out of that motel room, I knew something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer just a widow navigating loss. I was a woman standing at the edge of a truth that demanded action. I turned my phone back on that morning, and was greeted by missed calls and messages filled with concern that now felt rehearsed. I replied to none of them. Instead, I called a lawyer, one my husband had never met, one recommended by no one connected to our life. I scheduled meetings. I asked questions. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than fear. The people who thought I was grieving, confused, and easily guided had no idea I was watching them just as closely. I smiled when they checked in. I listened when they offered advice. And quietly, deliberately, I stopped giving anything away. Information, access, trust. Because grief may have softened me, but betrayal had sharpened me into something far more dangerous. Someone who finally saw the whole picture. I returned home 2 days later wearing the same quiet face everyone expected of a grieving widow. But nothing inside me was the same. The house felt different now, not emptier but watched. Every room held echoes of conversations I was no longer sure had been honest. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if my own walls might be listening. Family members checked in more frequently than before, their concern arriving wrapped in suggestions. Had I thought about selling the house? Was it really safe for me to live alone? Wouldn't it be easier if someone helped manage my finances? Each question sounded reasonable on the surface. Yet beneath them ran a current of urgency I hadn't noticed before. I nodded, thanked them, told them I needed time. Time, I had learned, was power. I began reviewing documents late at night, spreading papers across the dining table the way investigators do in movies. Insurance statements, bank transfers, legal filings I barely remembered signing. Patterns emerged quickly once I knew what to look for. Accounts opened without my knowledge. Assets moved temporarily. Powers granted under the guise of protection. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that my husband's disappearance had created a vacuum others were eager to fill. They hadn't planned his death, but they had certainly prepared to profit from it. What surprised me most wasn't the betrayal itself, but how calmly it had been carried out. No raised voices, no force. Just steady pressure, layered politeness, and the assumption that grief had made me incapable of resistance. I realized then that they didn't see me as an obstacle. They saw me as a formality to be processed. And that realization stripped away the last of my hesitation. I met with the lawyer the following morning. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed and refreshingly direct. I told her everything, what I had seen at the funeral, the messages, the staged death, the documents my husband had given me. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "They made one critical mistake." I asked what that was. She smiled slightly. "They underestimated you." Together, we began undoing the damage. Freezing accounts. Revoking permissions. Requesting audits. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. When family members noticed the shift, their tone changed. Confusion crept in. Then irritation. One afternoon, my sister-in-law confronted me directly, her concern finally cracking to reveal something sharper. "People are saying you're being difficult," she warned. I looked at her calmly and replied, "People can say whatever they like." The look on her face told me she hadn't expected that answer. At night, fear still found me. I won't pretend it didn't. I double-checked locks, kept lights on, jumped at unfamiliar sounds. But alongside the fear grew something steadier, resolve. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was watching, waiting, letting them reveal themselves through impatience and mistakes. And they did. Subtle ones at first. A document requested too quickly. A lie that didn't align with another. Small cracks in a carefully maintained story. My husband remained a shadow, present only through occasional, cautious messages. He warned me when pressure would increase, when certain names might surface again. I no longer asked him why he had chosen this path. That reckoning could wait. Right now, survival, mine, came first. And strangely, I felt more alive than I had in years. Not because of danger, but because I was finally acting instead of enduring. One evening, as I sat alone at the same dining table where I had once signed papers blindly, I understood something with startling clarity. They needed me compliant, quiet, predictable. And I was none of those things anymore. I wasn't announcing my strength. I wasn't demanding respect. I was simply refusing to give anything away for free. Not my trust, not my voice, not my future. The game had shifted. They just didn't know it yet. The pressure didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as concern and wrapped in politeness, but I felt it tightening around me day by day. Phone calls increased. Visits became unannounced, and conversations that once felt supportive now carried an edge, as if everyone was carefully measuring my reactions. They wanted reassurance, proof that I was still grieving, still fragile, still controllable. I gave them none of it. Instead, I listened. I watched how their words shifted when I didn't respond the way they expected, how impatience slipped through cracks in their sympathy. It was astonishing how quickly kindness evaporated when compliance didn't follow. That was when I knew I was no longer playing defense. I was observing predators who believed their prey was cornered. One afternoon, a document arrived by courier, urgent, official-looking, and completely unnecessary. It requested my signature to streamline ongoing matters. I recognized the tactic immediately. Fear dressed as efficiency. I didn't sign it. Instead, I forwarded it to my lawyer, who confirmed what I already suspected. Signing would have quietly transferred authority I had just reclaimed. When I declined, the response was swift. Accusations followed, subtle at first. I was being paranoid, influenced, difficult to work with. It didn't matter. Every accusation was confirmation that I was doing exactly what I needed to do. That night, my husband messaged me again. Short, cautious. He said things were moving faster than anticipated, that certain people were growing nervous. He warned me to expect a confrontation soon. Not necessarily loud or violent, but decisive. A line in the sand. I stared at my phone long after the message disappeared, anger and clarity twisting together in my chest. This was the part he hadn't protected me from. The loneliness of standing alone while everyone else pretended nothing was wrong. But even through the resentment, I understood why he had vanished. Fear had driven him into hiding. Strength was driving me forward. The confrontation came sooner than expected. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. Just a family dinner arranged for my sake. The table was set carefully, smiles rehearsed, conversations choreographed. Halfway through the meal, the questions began. Leading questions. Financial ones. Emotional ones. Did I feel overwhelmed? Was I sleeping? Had I thought about relocating? I answered calmly, deliberately vague, watching their expressions tighten with each non-answer. Finally, someone said it plainly. Maybe it was time I let others help make decisions. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. I set my fork down and met their eyes one by one. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply said I was managing my affairs independently now, with professional guidance, and that any future decisions would be mine alone. The shift was immediate. Disappointment hardened into resentment. Concern vanished completely. For the first time, I saw them clearly, not as family, not as allies, but as people whose patience had run out. And that clarity was oddly freeing. After that night, the atmosphere changed entirely. Communication became formal, distant, cold. The warmth they once performed disappeared because it no longer served them. I was no longer useful in the role they had assigned me. But that was fine. I didn't need their approval. I needed their mistakes. And they were beginning to make plenty. Sloppy ones. Desperate ones. Moves driven by frustration instead of strategy. Behind the scenes, my lawyer uncovered more than we expected. Inconsistencies in statements. Timelines that didn't align. A network of quiet assumptions that my silence would continue forever. It hadn't occurred to them that grief could sharpen someone instead of dulling them. That realization felt powerful. Not in a triumphant way, but in a grounded, steady way. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was protecting myself. And protection, I learned, often looks like patience. Still, the emotional toll was real. There were nights I sat alone, staring at old photos, wondering how many smiles had been genuine and how many had been calculated. Trust, once broken, doesn't shatter cleanly, it splinters, embedding itself painfully into every memory. But instead of breaking me, it was forcing me to rebuild with intention. Slowly, carefully, on my own terms. As weeks passed, one truth became undeniable. They had misjudged me from the beginning. They assumed grief would silence me, that fear would keep me compliant. They never imagined that the woman they overlooked was learning, adapting, and quietly taking control of a situation they believed was already resolved. They thought the story had ended at the funeral. They were wrong, because this wasn't the aftermath anymore. This was the turning point. By the time I realized how deep the web went, I was no longer shocked, only focused. What unsettled me most wasn't the deception itself, but how comfortably everyone had lived inside it. Lies layered over routine, manipulation disguised as concern, control masked as protection. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every phone call carried subtext. Every pause in conversation felt deliberate. They were no longer asking questions. They were probing for weakness, trying to determine how much I knew. And I knew enough. The first real crack appeared through something mundane. A bank notification that didn't match my records. At first glance, it looked like an administrative error. But when I traced it back, I found a pattern. Small movements. Carefully spaced. Designed not to raise alarms. Someone had assumed I wouldn't look too closely. That grief had made me careless. That assumption was their greatest mistake. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, who went quiet for longer than usual before finally saying, "This isn't negligence. This is coordination." The word lingered in my mind long after the call ended. I started documenting everything. Not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. Dates, times, tone shifts. Who said what, and when. People reveal more than they realize when they think the outcome is already secured. One conversation in particular stood out. A relative casually referenced a decision I hadn't shared with anyone. When I asked how they knew, the explanation came too quickly, rehearsed, incomplete. That was when I understood I wasn't just being watched. I was being discussed, planned around, anticipated. They weren't reacting to me. They were trying to stay ahead of me. My husband reached out again, this time with urgency threaded through his words. He warned me that pressure was mounting, that someone had started asking questions they shouldn't be asking. He didn't give names, but he didn't have to. I already knew who was panicking. Fear changes behavior. People rush. They overreach. They slip. And that was exactly what was happening now. Their confidence was cracking under the weight of uncertainty. Still, the loneliness was crushing. There's a particular kind of isolation that comes from realizing you're surrounded by people who don't wish you well, even if they smile while speaking to you. I missed the version of my life where trust was simple, where intentions didn't need to be decoded. But I also recognized that longing as a weakness I couldn't afford. Nostalgia is dangerous when you're trying to survive something deliberate. The tension escalated when I was invited to what was framed as a clarifying conversation. Neutral location. Legal language softened with reassurances. I agreed to attend, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to observe. The room was calm, professional, almost sterile. They spoke carefully, avoiding direct accusations while hinting at concerns about my stability, my judgment, my emotional state. It was subtle, strategic, and deeply insulting. They weren't trying to help me. They were building a narrative. I listened without interruption. Let them speak. Let them believe they were steering the conversation. When it was my turn, I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I asked questions instead. Precise ones. About timelines. About authorizations. About assumptions that had been made without my consent. I watched as confidence drained from their expressions, replaced by something far more telling, recognition. They realized I wasn't the confused widow they had prepared for. I was informed. I was alert. And I was no longer alone. After that meeting, everything shifted. Communication stopped being polite and started becoming cautious. They were no longer testing me. They were retreating, regrouping. Silence can be louder than confrontation. And this silence told me everything. They were afraid of exposure. Not public exposure. Legal exposure. The kind that doesn't care about intentions or relationships. Only evidence. At night, sleep came in fragments. My mind replayed conversations, facial expressions, inconsistencies. But beneath the exhaustion was something new, resolve. I wasn't driven by anger anymore. I was driven by clarity. Whatever had been set in motion long before my husband's disappearance was now unraveling, thread by thread. And I was holding one end of it firmly. The most painful realization came quietly. Even if my husband returned tomorrow, nothing could go back to how it was. Too much had been revealed. Too many masks had slipped. This experience had changed me in ways I couldn't reverse. I was no longer willing to shrink myself for the comfort of others. I had learned the cost of silence, and I wasn't paying it again. What they didn't understand, what they never anticipated, was that patience doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's preparation. And sometimes it's the calm before consequences arrive. Because the truth was no longer buried. It was waiting. And in the next chapter, it would surface. By the time the truth finally began to surface, it didn't arrive with drama or shouting or sudden revelations. It crept in quietly, almost respectfully, as if it understood how much damage it carried. It started with a document my lawyer forwarded late one evening, marked simply as confirmed. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I didn't understand it, but because some part of me had still hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. The signatures were real. The dates aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. Decisions about my life, my finances, my future had been made while I was grieving, distracted, and trusting. That trust had been used like a blindfold. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how ordinary it all felt. No villains twirling mustaches. No dramatic confessions. Just people who believed they were entitled to decide for me because they thought I wouldn't fight back. Because they thought grief made me small. Because they mistook silence for surrender. I realized then that what I was feeling wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was grief for the version of myself who believed loyalty was mutual by default. I requested one final meeting. Not out of desperation, but necessity. Closure doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from confrontation. The room was fuller this time. Familiar faces sat stiffly, avoiding my eyes. There was no warmth left, no pretense of concern. Just tension. They spoke first, outlining justifications, rationalizations, phrases like best interest and unfortunate timing. I let them finish. I always let people reveal themselves completely before responding. Then I spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, but clearly. I laid out what I knew, what I could prove, and what would happen next. I watched the color drain from faces that had once looked at me with pity. Pity had turned into calculation. Calculation into fear. Someone tried to interrupt me. I didn't allow it. For once, the room belonged to me. I explained that this wasn't revenge. It was accountability. That I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in restoration. My life. My autonomy. My dignity. I told them the narrative they'd built around me would not survive scrutiny, and neither would their silence. When I finished, no one argued. That was the loudest response of all. Afterward, the quiet felt different. Lighter. As if something heavy had finally been set down. I walked out alone, but I didn't feel lonely. I felt grounded. There's a strange peace that comes when you stop waiting for people to do the right thing and start doing it yourself. I didn't know what consequences would unfold next. Legal processes move slowly, but I knew one thing for certain. The power imbalance they had relied on no longer existed. In the days that followed, messages trickled in. Some apologetic. Some defensive. Some pretending nothing had happened at all. I didn't respond to most of them. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. I had said what needed to be said in the only room that mattered. Everything else was noise. I began reorganizing my life in small, intentional ways. Closing accounts. Opening new ones. Making plans that didn't involve permission or explanation. Every decision felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been quietly taken. And then, unexpectedly, my husband contacted me again. His message was different this time. Shorter. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged what I already knew. That things had gone too far. That control had replaced care somewhere along the way. That fear had driven choices he could no longer justify. I didn't reply immediately. Some truths require time, not response. I needed to decide whether hearing him again would bring clarity or reopen wounds that were finally beginning to close. That night, I sat alone and thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of all this. The one who believed stability meant silence, who thought endurance was the same as strength. I understood her now. I forgave her. She did what she knew how to do with what she was given. But I wasn't her anymore. I had changed, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Survival has a way of reshaping you until you recognize yourself again. Stronger, sharper, unafraid. I realized something else too. No matter how this ended, reconciliation, separation, permanent distance, I would be okay. Not because everything was fixed, but because I was no longer waiting to be chosen, believed, or protected. I had done that for myself. And once you cross that line, there's no going back. The story wasn't over yet. There were still consequences to face, truths to finalize, decisions to make. But the most important shift had already happened. I was no longer reacting to what was being done to me. I was deciding what would happen next. And in the final part of this story, everything that had been hidden would finally be named, out loud, without fear, and without apology. The morning everything finally settled, I woke before the alarm, the house quiet in a way that no longer felt heavy but honest. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, catching dust in the air, and for the first time in months, my chest didn't feel tight with anticipation or dread. There were still unanswered questions, still loose ends, but I understood now that clarity doesn't always arrive as a dramatic moment. It often comes as a quiet certainty that you are no longer lost. I made coffee, sat at the table, and allowed myself to sit with the truth instead of running from it. I didn't need explanations anymore. I had perspective, and that was enough. The legal matters resolved the way truth usually does, slowly, methodically, without mercy for manipulation. Documents were corrected. Authority was restored where it belonged. Some people apologized. Others disappeared entirely, choosing distance over accountability. I didn't chase either response. I had learned that remorse is only meaningful when it's paired with change. And silence can sometimes be the most honest admission of guilt. What mattered was that decisions about my life were mine again. No signatures forged in grief. No whispered agreements behind my back. Just me, standing on solid ground I had rebuilt piece by piece. My husband and I spoke one last time. Not to argue, not to relive the past, but to acknowledge it. He admitted fear, of aging, of irrelevance, of losing control over the image he had carefully constructed. I listened, not because I needed closure from him, but because listening without absorbing is a skill grief teaches you. When he asked what I wanted now, I surprised both of us by answering honestly, peace. Not revenge. Not validation. Peace that didn't depend on his understanding or approval. We agreed to part with dignity, if not agreement. Some endings aren't meant to be gentle, just clear. As the weeks passed, life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became mine. I rearranged the house, not because it needed to change, but because I did. I took down photos that felt like performances, and kept the ones that felt like memories. I reconnected with people who had known me before I learned how to shrink myself. I traveled alone for the first time in decades, standing on unfamiliar streets with no one to impress and no role to play. Each step felt like proof that freedom doesn't announce itself. It unfolds quietly, one brave choice at a time. What surprised me most was how little anger I carried. I had expected rage, bitterness, a desire to make others hurt the way I had. But what replaced it was something stronger. Clarity. I understood now that betrayal says more about the betrayer's fear than the victim's worth. I wasn't discarded because I was weak. I was underestimated because I was steady. And steadiness, I learned, is terrifying to those who rely on chaos to feel powerful. I began telling my story not to expose anyone, but to reclaim myself. Not every detail needed to be shared. Some truths are sacred. But the essence mattered. That silence is not the same as consent. That love should never require erasure. And that age does not diminish your right to adventure, dignity, or voice. People often ask me now how I found the courage to stand up after everything that happened. The truth is, I didn't find it. It found me, waiting quietly beneath years of being overlooked. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. You don't owe anyone your suffering. You don't have to stay quiet to keep the peace. And starting over doesn't mean failure. It means survival with intention. Whether you're listening from a kitchen table, a long commute, or a quiet room you thought no one noticed, know this. You are not invisible. Your story matters. And it's never too late to choose yourself. This wasn't a story about loss in the end. It was a story about return. I didn't lose my life. I reclaimed it. And that finally was the ending I deserved.